everybody, cinephiles alike. Welcome back to Flicker with Jack and Scott. My name is Jack Hanley. I'm a film critic, programmer, and passionate cinephile, joined as always by my cinematic partner in crime, also a film critic, also a programmer, also a passionate cinephile, my beloved friend Scott Agner. How are you, buddy?
Woo! I'm great. How about yourself?
It's amazing, and it's so great to be back on the air with you.
Yes, as always,
right?
love doing these, and I'm happy to be back here with
Well,
you.
and we kind of had a little bit of a sabbatical with all of the fall festival season.
Fall festival
which we'll
season.
talk about later on in this short podcast. Yep. I'm happy to be back, but we're back for a very special reason this time too.
Yeah.
Not only to just celebrate the glory that is spooky season and Halloween, but we're back with a very special short Halloween edition to announce a very special project. That's a subsidiary of Flicker and Jack and Scott. And that is a brand new podcast, horror-centric podcast that's coming out that is called The History of You in 5 Horror Films, which will be the newest horror podcast, not only from Flicker with Jack and Scott, but also as part of the Real Weird Horror Collective Network. So Scott, I know a lot of people know us from Blind Spotting and our more artistic and critical take, our deep deconstruction on some higher art films, and then here in our more general film discussion podcast with Flicker with Jack and Scott. But people who know us well know that we both harbor a secret and amazing passion for the genre that is horror.
Yes.
Both horror. Tell me a little about your history of why you love horror so much.
I didn't for a long time, and I think that's part of my interesting history with it. For a long time, when I was younger, I refused to watch them. They were films that I had a history. Well, I'll talk about it in a little bit here. History with some films, and it wasn't until I was a little bit older, I think, kind of early teenage years, that my perspective on that kind of shifted a little bit. I got to that point where I started to realize what the films were doing and what they were designed to do, and was able to kind of separate them from that reality a bit. And from there, they just became something that I just really started to enjoy. I really kind of dove in. I wanted to learn the history, so I was diving in and watching older films and then keeping up with the current films. And as you know, now we've gone through a couple moments in history where we have what's being described as, right, like these like high art combination films, right? Where we get these moments where it starts to become a little bit more than just what some of the sort of traditional views of horror are as well. So it's kind of nice to kind of go back and experience that ebb and flow of the different genres and how things have kind of come and gone. And I just think it's a fun genre to be a part of. Well, fun fandom too.
I'm absolutely thrilled that not only for us to drop this new horror-centric podcast, but also that you and I will both be a part of it. I know our longtime producer and great friend and fellow cinephile and programmer and critic, Shay Westcott, who is producer of this show and our other endeavors together, will also be on occasionally. And so just to kind of do a quick introduction, it's essentially just a basic interview show where I really try to delve into, as it says quite simply, the history of you and your relationship with horror as a genre and those films that made a mark on you in some way or another, right? And how they affected your life, that kind of shaped you in a way, which we believe in film as absolutely fundamentally having the ability to quite literally change your life. So in that sense, we wanted to do a very short little version just to kind of give our audiences a taste. So Scott, I'm going to put you on the hot seat tonight with some questions.
Yeah, I'm happy to be the first
the
test subject of this new experiment.
But my bestie over here with this. So yes, I'm glad you're willing to play with this. So let's talk about this for a second. So Scott, what is the very first horror film that you remember? Could be like the very first one you saw, or just the first one that had a major impact on you.
Yeah, I was thinking about that question a little bit, and I don't know that I could actually identify what the first one I saw was. I'm not sure that I have a good enough memory to dive back far enough into that, but I do know that there are two that stick out to me as ones that I remember being really early in those experiences. Films that I definitely saw, I would say, as a child, still too young to probably see those films, catching glimpses of them, peeking out from my bedroom as my parents are watching them, kind of thing. And those two films would be, and this is kind of interesting too. So first one is Critters, which, you know, if we want to classify that as a horror film.
Absolutely.
And I think that's what makes my other memory of another one kind of interesting, which is the Tales from the Dark Side movie. So not the show,
Yes.
but the movie.
Yes.
And I think it's interesting that both of those early memories are also kind of flirting with that horror comedy genre.
Yeah.
So I just think that's kind of interesting that two of my earlier memories come from that same kind of.
May I ask
that
where
same
you
kind
saw
of
these?
genre. I saw those at home. And I think both experiences with those it was an experience of either catching it on probably on maybe on television
Yeah,
even,
yeah,
I'm not
sure.
entirely sure, or catching it while my parents were watching it. You know, they'd rented it, they were trying to have their evening watching that, and I'm sort of watching from the bedroom doorway knowing that I probably shouldn't be watching that. So probably those two kinds of experiences, I think, not theater experiences for sure.
You know, and I suspect that with the majority of our upcoming guests that we will be interviewing, that's going to be a fundamental reoccurring early remembrance, right? Just like typically at home, and most likely seeing a film you probably weren't ready for that just drastically affected you. I never really try as host to ever kind of bring my own point into this, but I felt compelled to just quickly just leave a hint that I won't have to say what my actual very first horror film was, but when your best friend sends you some amazing some albums that because he knows you so well that he knows your fundamental first horror film and first scary experience also at home with a made-for-television movie that scared the living shit out of me. I just had to drop that. And, you know, I cherish listening to this all the time and every year, so just had to drop that out there. So,
fun story and a great score.
Listeners out there, the point of this is, it is the greatest privilege to be the friend of Scott Ogden. I just want you to know that. And I'm jealous that all of you don't get to experience that if you haven't met him yet. So, all right, on to question number 2. And Critters is a great first. I'm glad that the very first answer of this podcast is officially Critters. So let's go.
Right? Leave it to us, right?
All right, let's what film, right, okay, we all know fear is so subjective, right? And what scares you might not scare me and vice versa, and it's very interesting, or even at various times in your life, what scares you can be fundamentally different or evolve, right? What is a film that you really found that just give me an example, and there could be many here, but give me an example of one film that really scares you, and why?
Yeah, so I think for two, I'll give a sort of two-part answer, I think, and try to keep it a little bit brief here. But I think the first answer ties back to that early experience. And like you said, I think that's something that we probably will hear commonly with answers, because I think those early films that you do perhaps see before you probably should be, you know, of the age of watching those films, those tend to be the ones that scare you. I think we have that connection to that experience. So my first one would go back to Tales of the Dark Side, but specifically the segment from that is I think the title of that segment is The Cat from Hell, and that's the one segment particularly that got to me. And the reason for that is we had a black cat growing up. So you know the general plot line of that, if you're unfamiliar, is right this demonic cat from hell that then they're hired to sort of get rid of this thing, and it keeps coming back, and you know, eventually there's this scene where gross scene, right, where it crawls down the guy's throat and it's all super. But we had a black cat growing up, so for me, after seeing that, especially when I would like wake up in the middle of the night and have to run to the bathroom on the other side of the house, I would like have to run because I knew that if I saw our cat, I was gonna like freak out. And I do have that one specific memory of kind of walking past it was our door that led down to our basement, and I had to walk past that to get to our bathroom, and the cat just like comes running up the stairs from the basement as I'm already kind of running past and just being completely terrified because of that film, right? There's no other reason for me to be afraid of a black cat other than having seen that segment. So that would be my first answer. My second answer, I'll sort of go more contemporary, because I think as I've gotten older, and as I've become more kind of involved in watching horror films, I've found that horror films don't really scare me anymore.
Sure.
It's pretty rare that I watch something and I actually kind of, you know, I appreciate them. I love the films that are fun to deconstruct and fun to kind of dive into the deeper stuff, but it's not often that they really kind of do that same thing that I did when I was younger. But one that did a little bit of that, I could say that's more recent, is The Witch, which I think first time seeing that was a theatrical experience for me. I was not sort of watching it at home. And I think what it did is it created a kind of mood and a feeling that that is probably as close as I've gotten to that fear of, childhood films. Like I remember sitting there and noticing that my hands were gripping the armrests a little too tight. And that's kind of abnormal, right? I don't usually have that experience,
Right.
but I remember noticing like, wow, this film is definitely doing something to me because I'm actually kind of sitting here clenching the armrests a little bit. And so it definitely did something in creating a mood. I love that you and I have had many conversations about that. We had large talkbacks about that film at festivals that we've programmed that for. But that's a film that I treasure greatly, not only because it's such a great film and has so much great content to discuss, but because it did that a little bit. It holds a special place in that history for me because it brought back that feeling a little bit.
Sure, no, that's a fantastic answer. And I know on a personal level too, I treasure that film as well because of our joint relationship to that film, our many hours of discussion about it, what it means to how we've programmed it too. So it's a very special film. I think the real tragedy of your answer though here, Scott, is the fact that your black cat never truly understood why the nature of your relationship changed after that segment. Just for him, it was like,
probably.
one day Scott got weird. It's all he knows.
You're like, man, what happened to that guy?
No, those are fantastic answers. And the last little piece of that I agree with you in is many times the films today that we encounter as we're older, as our just different space in our lives than we are. I'm with you that it's not necessarily a full-on chilling scare or abject horror, but many times just this horrible feeling of dread or unease or anxiety that a really good film. J-horror, weirdly, I've kind of reflected back, really does that for me, where I might not be as scared in the moment, but I have an uneasy feeling for days or a sense of anxiety.
It's that existential piece, right? That kind of sticks with
and
you.
I think those are just really both dreadful and exciting at the same time. All right, buddy.
Yeah.
So wrapping up with our third and final question, what is the iconic or non-iconic horror scene, just scene only, that still haunts you to this day?
So that is very clear to me because this scene had a similar effect to the Tales from the Dark Side one, but I think in a much more profound way that the scene still to this day is something that, like, if I think about this scene, I'm like, man, that's a rough scene, and it really kind of burned into the brain, right? And that's a scene from Candyman, the original Candyman.
Oh yes.
Which, is a film, again, that I saw far before I should have. That's not a film that any young person should be watching remotely. It's a pretty gory film. It's a pretty gross film. A pretty great film, really. I mean, going back and watching it, as an older person going back and watching it, you realize that there's a lot of good social commentary even inside of that you didn't catch when I, saw it as a child, for sure. But it's a specific scene where they're sort of diving into the myth of it, right? And so it's this scene about the boy. If I remember a character's name, I think it's Jake or something like that, and he's telling the story. So it's not something that is actually happening as a part of that plot line, but it's that kind of that myth-making storytelling element. And it's the one where the boy goes into the bathroom. And there's that kind of like castration scene, right? He gets hit with the hook and he's laying on the ground.
Devastating. I remember exactly watching that scene.
Yeah, made me terrified of public restrooms. So that's the cause and effect, right? So then it was like I refused to go into a public restroom alone because I was like afraid of that scene. And it's one tiny scene. It's not a huge scene at all. Right. It's a very quick little kind of myth-making flashback storytelling type of scene, but the idea of that stuck with me. I think looking back on it, that one of the things that really had an impact about that is that it showed you in that film, which is something that's oftentimes seen as a taboo even in horror films, is it showed you that children weren't safe. Oftentimes children are safe in horror films. That's kind of like we won't do it to children. Yeah. We'll do the worst things imaginable to adults and teenagers. We're not going to do it to children. And that was a moment, I think, like, I look back on it now, I'm like, man, that's right. Like, that's not something you see commonly. And it really makes it a threat. It makes it feel like a totally different ballgame, a totally different threat that's present there.
Right.
So
No, you're so right about that
that's
too.
that
When you
one.
kind of think back, there's almost like this unspoken rule we all had in our relationship to a lot of horror, right? And when these
Yeah.
type of certain taboos with like regarding children or animals
Hmm.
are
Yep.
subverted, what an impact
Yep.
that has. You are so, and you know
Yeah.
what? You're not the first person that's mentioned that they didn't go into restrooms again. I mean, just from general conversation. So I love that it kind of had
Yeah.
almost like a public urban effect that like what Jaws did for the beach, this did for kind of like
Absolutely.
public
Absolutely.
places, right? That's profound.
And I think it's tied to that whole concept, which is, a fundamental part of that film, which is urban legends, right? Like the
Yeah,
storytelling
yeah.
of urban legends and the growth of that myth. And I think urban legends do that. I think they do that to people. If we're talking apart from films, even that's what urban legends are designed to do,
Right,
right?
right.
That's why they exist. That's what they're meant to be, these cautionary tales. That's why they exist. So when you factor that into the level of what's taking place in that film, I think it makes total sense to make those connections, and have those things feel that way.
Oh my God. Well, Scott, these are magnificent answers, and eventually we'll tempt you back on for the long form version of this, where we will delve deeper into the psyche that is your relationship with horror films. But we thank you for our people that watch, just to kind of see a little taste of what we hope to bring with this podcast. And it's going to be an upcoming podcast you'll be able to find on any of the networks out there, on Apple Podcasts, wherever you find Blind Spotting, which we hope you're also listening to, enjoying, which we're going to be back with a horror-adjacent look at the film The Shout, which we're very excited
Yep,
was
dropping soon.
submitted by a user of ours, so we're excited to get back and hit that as well. One of the many Stokes we have in the fire that we're doing here.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yeah.
so be on the lookout for A History of You and 5 horror films that will be coming very soon. And the idea too, out there, dear watchers and listeners alike, is that we will be reaching out to horror fanatics across all walks of life. So there'll be a lot of horror directors we'll bring on, like filmmakers. We'll bring in actors and actresses in the genre, but also just programmers and casual fans, people that just love and appreciate this genre as much as we do. And I love that we broke ground with a small taste of the horror that it resides in my partner Scott out there. So I loved that. Scott, as we're about to wrap up for the special Halloween edition, it'll be dropping here in Halloween. So we wish you all a wonderful Halloween and hope you're celebrating it by watching some amazing films, including the one that my partner has put in the background over there, which we were just talking about before going live. What a performance, Hunter Schafer. Let's drop that out there.
Yep.
That's a great one.
Fantastic,
But either way, we just
fantastic
hope
film.
you're out there watching something scary and fundamentally great. And if anything, from Scott's first answer to the importance of finding that great horror film, putting it on for your children, and then immediately abandoning them to suffer the traumas by themselves, like all of us have. That's that ritual that we need to continue. Peeking out from somewhere and being like, why am I watching
Yep.
The Fog?
Another great
Which is
example.
a great
Another
example,
great film.
right? So
Another great film.
thank you for
Yep.
that. But as we close out with this, and again with our listeners, we will be making our return back to the studio now from our sabbatical for more of our longer form Flicker with
Yeah.
Jack and Scott. And Scott, you had a magnificent idea for what would be the theme of our next couple of ones that we have coming out. Please tell our audience what they could be looking forward to very shortly from us.
Yeah, so in addition to Blind Spotting, which you mentioned is dropping soon, we'll get into that. We've got this idea for our Flickr episodes, our regular Flickr episodes, where we thought it would be fun to dive into some of our history with programming. We both have some pretty rich history with programming and working for film festivals. I'm part of selection teams and really kind of curating some choice films into those festivals. So we thought it would be fun to revisit that a little bit, to go back and pick some of our selections that we were partially responsible for, fully responsible for, vouched heavily for, argued with in some cases to bring onto those teams and those festivals. And just going back into that as an opportunity to celebrate some of those great films, have some conversations about those, reflect on a little bit of our history involved with that process. We thought we'd probably break this part into a couple episodes, so we should have a series of those coming out. We'll be dropping those regularly and giving you some more fun stuff to watch, fun gems that maybe you haven't heard of. And just to celebrate a little bit of some of those great films that we love so much.
Gosh, it's such a brilliant idea. And again, that was our original, that's how we met. That forged our original lifelong friendship, was being in those trenches together, really trying to capture and do some amazing programming, and especially trying to bring some very independent, little known
Yeah.
often and international cinema to our programming. So I'm really excited that we might have some of our listeners and watchers out there be introduced to some great cinema that we were excited
Yep.
about then that may have gone under the radar that they can experience,
Yeah.
and hopefully we can bring back. There'll be a lot of stories, sometimes sadness and anger about how our selections were treated at said festivals, but we stand by them. So,
Yep.
brother, thank you again. It's so great to see you back over here in the air. And
Yeah.
to all of our watchers and listeners out there, thank you again for joining us for this very short special episode on Halloween of Flicker with Jack and Scott. If you like us and you like this podcast and this show on YouTube, please like, follow. That's how we gain people and gain traction there. So we really appreciate you. And as always, long live independent cinema. Brother, I love you, and I can't wait to see you back here soon.
See you next time.
Have a good one, man.